All right. Well, it is always a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Marion, who has been, I think, one of the founding members of outdoor ethics on the research and scientific side. Many of you may wonder about how did we develop outdoor ethics, and it really developed in many ways out of the work in the field of recreational ecology. And that field was looking at the impacts that visitors have in wild areas in particular. And over time, that has grown to look at impacts on recreational areas as well. And Dr. Marion, who has been doing this research for many years and has a long connection with scouting with the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics, having served on their advisory committee for a number of years, has, I think, been integral in bringing together both the ethical and that scientific component together into what we now understand as outdoor ethics. And so it is always a great pleasure to introduce my friend and a great researcher, Jeff Marion. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that introduction. Let's see, I'm waiting for them to share my screen. I'll go ahead and get started. So it's my pleasure to be here today. It's great to see the tremendous participation that we have. Let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen now. It's great to see the participation we have in the conference today, and I wanted to thank all of the folks who are listening in today for all of your efforts in developing and participating in the programming and the communication of low-impact outdoor practices and ethics to our scouting youth and adults. Secondly, I wanted to thank the leadership of the BSA National Outdoor Ethics Committee, the National Office staff of the BSA, and then in particular to the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics staff for all that they do in helping us put on this program of education to the scouting community. And finally today, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my father. My father introduced me to the outdoors along with 3 other sons. He managed to shepherd all 4 of us along the path to Eagle. We all got Eagle Scout. Many of us went to Philmont. I ended up working at Philmont for 5 summers. He's celebrating today his 99th birthday. And so I'm sitting right now in a Louisville hotel room using a cell phone to light my face because it's dark. And I'll be seeing my dad and celebrating his 99th birthday here in just a couple hours. And so at any rate, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to be talking with you about some of the exciting new findings from Recreation Ecology. This is a very small field of study where we investigate visitor impacts to protected natural areas like parks and wilderness and refuges, Bureau of Land Management lands, and so on and so forth. I'm employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, so I'm a government scientist, a federal scientist, but I'm stationed at Virginia Tech, where I also wear that hat of being an adjunct faculty member. So you'll be seeing today a number of our studies that I work with doctoral students here at Virginia Tech. I wanted to start by just highlighting what I do locally here. I've been the leader of a venture crew for 16 years now, and before that, a scoutmaster for 4.5 years. And we didn't allow COVID to stop our work this summer. We went on a record 11 different canoe trips. We found every good tree swing in the region and went off them into the rivers, lots of different rivers here in the Blacksburg area. So we had a blast. We developed and followed some very, very conservative COVID safety precautions and had a very successful summer. So let me go ahead and introduce this field of study. It's a very small field of study. There's perhaps only, I'm going to say 6 or so people in the U.S. that would call themselves recreation ecologists, and perhaps only 2 or 3 more in the rest of the world. But it's something that I'm very passionate about. I've been doing since 1982, and I'm nearing the end of my career now. But it's taken me to some amazing protected natural areas all around the world, and you'll see some of that here today, including this picture on trail research at Haleakala National Park in Maui, Hawaii. That's the only slide you'll see on trails today. I've decided to focus this whole presentation on on camping and camping-related leave no trace research and guidance. So this small field of study that evaluates these resource impacts, we measure and monitor them, try to characterize them and quantify them, but more importantly, we seek to understand how do these impacts relate to factors that managers can manipulate, like use-related factors, type and amount of use, season of use, or environmental factors like topography and veg type and soil type, and from that develop some best management practices. And so my objectives today are to sort of review some results from recent campsite-related studies that demonstrate the need for and efficacy of leave no trace practices in education, the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then discuss some of the leave no trace implications from recent studies and focus on those. And in the last 10 years, I've managed to bring in some of the more senior youth, generally it's the summer before after their senior year of high school, and recruited some of those folks into our research studies. And so this young woman here is Haley, and she has done research with my doctoral students and I out in the Desolation Wilderness in the Sierras in California, but also up in Banff National Park last summer, 2 summers ago, sorry. I'm going to be sharing some results from a number of different studies, but predominantly the last 5 years we've been doing studies on camping impacts, sustainable camping, along the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia and along the Pacific Crest Trail, the PCT. And we've worked there from the deep south of California near the Mexican border all the way up to the Canadian border at North Cascades National Park. This picture here was actually taken on one of my Venture Cruise summer trips. Every summer we go out west and we backpack in various places. This particular year we camped at this spot, and I was stuck shuttling cars, so I managed to backpack into this particular location after dark and went to bed, and in the morning got up and realized what a nightmare it was in terms of camping impacts. It's enormous area, but it's Twin Lakes, Oregon, the Mount Hood National Forest, and this typifies some of the problems we see in a lot of our studies in high use areas where you have visitors and unregulated, sort of unconfined camping, where they tend to gravitate to large, flat, popular areas, generally near water. There's a good water source nearby. And the campsite proliferation that happens where they're creating new campsites, the expansion that happens where 2 or 3 sites grow together and form what we now call a mega site. And then the new sites in the area form what we now call a mega cluster of campsites. These are all problems. And in those mega clusters, you have lots of other social problems, crowding, conflict, and noise, and so on and so forth. Imagine the worst, and that's what we see in these places. And so I managed to come back to this particular place. I contacted the Forest Service managers of this area, and we then came back 2 years later and did a special workshop there on sustainable camping. And so we brought in the doctoral students and collected a lot of data and measured all their campsites. And what you see here on the left is a very detailed map, topographical map, showing you that all of the camping that's occurring around that lake is in flat terrain. The majority of the camping is at that north end, and that's because the main trails come in right there. The Pacific Crest Trail goes right past. The one on the right is actually a slope map, and if you look at that, you'll notice that all of the campsites are in 0 to 5% grade or slope, so the flat areas. And as you're going to be seeing in this talk as I go further, one of the big findings, the big new findings from our work, is that we can solve or finesse a lot of these problems with campsite expansion and proliferation by shifting the camping from flat terrain to sloping terrain. And so I've placed in some of these blue campsite symbols in places that we might be moving camping to here in the future. That's what we're talking about right now. So I just threw those in to illustrate that. Here's another place that was a nightmare camping area along the Appalachian Trail back in 2000. We went to all the clubs that maintain the AT, asked them to contribute their worst places. And Annapolis Rocks, Maryland, the mega cluster of campsites here, has the acclaim of being named sort of the worst camping area on the Appalachian Trail back in 2000. And so again, we went in and measured these sites. We found 19 sites, 43,000 square feet of, sort of disturbed area, intensively camped out or disturbed area associated with this big mega cluster of campsites. And we measured all the other impacts that you can see there. Another place that we're doing just recently, working at just recently, is the Hawk Mountain, Georgia mega cluster of campsites. This particular one is down just 8 miles north, I believe, of Springer Mountain, Georgia. So it's generally the second night of backpacking, sometimes the first night of backpacking for all the thru hikers every year. And you can see there that, the thru hikers have been increasing in number substantially. So this picture shows sort of one of the first options that you can consider, that managers can consider to resolve some of these unregulated camping problems that we're seeing and that we're measuring, and that's camping dispersal, what I call pristine site camping. Now, this is probably the smallest of the options, or the least attractive of the options, which I'll get to in just a minute, but wanted to start with it because it's my favorite personally. I do this type of camping all the time. But you can see here that you're either looking for a really sunny place that's grassy to camp on, where you could camp one night and when you pull up your tent, the grass is bent down, but if you came back in a day, it would look very natural. Or you go to deep shade where you have very few plants growing, and you can kind of put up your tent or put up your hammock and avoid trampling those plants as you camp in that spot. And so let's go further and look at sort of some examples of vegetation response, and then a little bit more on this dispersed camping option, this pristine site camping option. This is from an experimental trampoline study where we go out into the forest and we set up lanes of vegetation. We trample them at different rates, like 1,000 passes or 500 passes or 100 passes. And we do before and after quadrat work. You see the quadrat in the lower left there. And I'm just showing you just the 1,000 pass, the highest, most intensive trampoline pass lane here. And as you can see, in a forested area where you've got forbs or broadleaf herbs, 1,000 passes wipes them all out. They're gone. You've got bare soil at the end of the day. If you came back in a month, you'd find that of the 20 or 25 species of herbs that were growing there are 2 or 3 species that managed to sort of bounce back or grow a few leaves. They generally are the species like violets that have a corm for a root, and they've got some starchy sugars there to regenerate some leaves. We also do these experiments in grassy areas, sunny grassy areas, and what we find there is that 1,000 passes definitely tramples down the grass, definitely looks impacted, but in fact, if you come back a month later, it looks identical to sort of your control area that got no trampling whatsoever. And so what we say here is that these broadleaf forbs that grow in shady forests have a very low resistance to traffic, and the grasses have a very high resistance to traffic. And then the forbs have a very low resilience. They don't recover very fast. But the grasses have a very high resilience. They recover very quickly. And so clearly what this means is that to the extent that we can, we want to avoid camping on forbs and preferably camp either on places that are so shady that you have very little vegetation cover, i.e. organic litter, or if you're out west on bedrock or gravel or that sort of thing, like along a stream or a river, you could camp on the sand or in gravel. But find a non-vegetated place to camp, or you find a dry grassy place to camp is sort of the other alternative. So that's the chief implication of these results. So back to the dispersed pristine site camping guidance. This is, in a nutshell, this is it. It's not rocket science. You choose a durable spot, which, as we've just said, is a really shady spot that doesn't have any veg or very little, and or you go to grasses, to a sunny meadow, or rock, and you camp, preferably, really, and this is pretty important actually, to be out of sight of any existing trail or other campsite. You want to be in a place that other people are never going to find and reuse. The whole name of the game here is to avoid all impact from your camping. And so you find a place that has no evidence of prior camping use, you know, a pristine spot. You camp there one night and you try to avoid stepping or trampling any plants. And that's why you're looking for a really shady spot. Or if you're on grasses, go ahead and trample them, but it's just one night and they bounce back, they recover, right? And then before you depart, you try to naturalize the spot. So if you're in this area, this is a campsite. You actually see my wife on the log there putting her boots on for the day of backpacking. This was a venture crew trip as well. We're on the Pacific Crest Trail. I think we were in the state of Washington. You take your tent down and you put back the sticks and pine cones and organic litter. And as you can see on the right, it took me no more than 5 minutes. The time it took her to put her boots on, and I was done. And then I took the after picture. And so you renaturalize that spot. And the idea is that anyone who might happen across this spot, you know, the next day or the week later would never see any evidence that you had camped there. And so this is sort of a no impact camping option. Now, the problem with this method of camping is if you screw up, you know, if you teach others and they screw up, then you've just created a brand new campsite. And so the managers sort of get a little antsy when I promote this style of camping, because many of them say, well, yeah, it's great if you do it well, but if you do it poorly, you're engaging in site proliferation. You're creating large numbers of new campsites. And so for that reason, it's not our best option. And I'm going to move to the best option here next. And I'm going to start by talking with you a little bit about some of the new research findings. And the most important of the new research findings coming out of these big AT and PCT studies is that sloping terrain is the key factor. In other words, when we leave people to their own devices, they generally gravitate towards big flat places where they can expand campsites and create new campsites and create, you know, sort of nightmarish both resource impact and social problems, crowding and conflicts and noise. And so if we're going to move them, you know, out of those places, where should we move them? And the research is very strongly pointing towards sloping terrain. And I'll illustrate that quite a bit here with some pictures. Another factor is rugosity, which I'm going to define as sort of uneven ground, like in the lower right picture, very uneven ground, or just big rocks and boulders all over the place. Or potentially, if you're in the east, it might be lots of roots, you know, at the surface of the ground, naturally occurring, or just uneven terrain. And then finally, grasses. You know, grasses are, again, resistant, resilient, and as you impact them, they push back. They try to recover constantly. And so grasses is kind of the third quality here. The lower left picture is kind of the topography. That's not a real steeply sloped site, but it's enough steep that the campsite's not going to expand, right? So let's look at some more examples. Here's an extreme example on the lower left picture of a campsite. This was one that I camped with my wife and a wilderness ranger that's been a longtime friend of ours in Olympic National Park just 2 summers ago. And, you know, that ridge has kind of got a flat top, but it's really small. And so it's actually, you know, the perfect kind of dispersed, pristine site that we could find. You know, it can't get bigger because of that terrain. And so it could be turned into a regular, you know, campsite. And yeah, you'd lose all the veg on top of that ridge, but that's the only place you'd lose it probably. On the lower right, that's an old campsite along the Appalachian Trail. And as you can see, over decades of time, visitors have cut down all the trees in that area on the site. And that's opened up the canopy to allow enough sunlight in to allow the grasses to come in. So the grasses are quite unnatural there. If you look in the offsite areas, you see no grass whatsoever. But because it's a big opening in the canopy, you get those grasses coming in. And you know, if you use that site a lot, you'll trample out some of those grasses. But if you get a nice wet year with not much use, the grasses will come right back. They'll come roaring back. And so the grasses are kind of that intermediary variable. It's definitely the third most important. But slopes and rugosity are really the name of the game in terms of preventing site expansion and proliferation problems, which are kind of the bane of backcountry and wilderness managers. And so if you look at the picture on the lower left here, you see kind of a natural bench. This is in a pretty rocky, rough area, lots of sloping terrain. And we were there so early doing our campsite study. On the very right of that picture, you see some snow. But that's a naturally occurring side hill campsite. In other words, it's got some flat terrain there, but it's completely natural in its occurrence. And we've now been looking at using geographic information systems, or GIS. And when we have LiDAR data, which is a laser type created data set, you know, you can put out literally 1 and 2 foot contour lines on maps with LiDAR data. Very, very accurate topographical data. We've been doing some analyses in GIS, and we've discovered that we can actually pick out these small, flat campsites surrounded by sloping terrain. And that's the key, is if you put a donut around the campsite and average the slope within the donut, it would be greater than about 15% grade. And that's the key number that our science has turned up. Is if you have a slope that's 15% or greater, you'll be walking along with that tent in your hand for quite a while before you'll ever find a good place that's flat enough to put that tent up. And so if you have a flat campsite surrounded by that kind of sloping terrain, the site, you could use it very intensively for decades and it would never get big, because the terrain around it is forcing you to spatially concentrate all of your camping activity on the flat spot, right? And so it's not rules and regulations that compelling you to do the right thing here. It's just the terrain. It's not your leave no trace knowledge or your leave no trace willingness to practice leave no trace that's having the success. It's just a person interacting with terrain. And I sort of find something really beautiful in that. Other issues that are really important to managers is trying to protect sensitive water resources like alpine lakes and mountainous streams, and have trout in them. Any sort of organic material and soils running off into those water bodies is quite degrading. Trout in particular, and many of the aquatic insects, can't handle the sedimentation that comes into those water bodies from recreation, from trails and campsites. And so we try to minimize that. Unfortunately, people love camping on shorelines. And so if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that's a pretty popular sort of alpine basin campsite. But notice all the rocks in it. In fact, those rocks were not natural. They were put there by managers, basically seasonal college students. They pick up a huge rock, sometimes with a net, a cargo net, and they bring it over and plop it down, and then they dig a big hole and they bury it. And they're trying to ruin every spot on that campsite, so you can't really put up a tent anywhere. And then they're trying to get you to move somewhere. Well, that's the problem, is where the heck do you move? And in our studies, we consistently found that when we moved back away from the lake shorelines, like in the picture on the right there, that campsite is literally 400 yards away from the lake. It's Thousand Island Lake. It's on the Inyo National Forest. But 400 yards from the lake, and it's on a high bench kind of around that lake. It's probably 100 vertical feet above the lake, maybe 75 vertical feet above the lake. But it's a site that hardly anyone ever finds, because it's kind of up in the trees on this little bench. And it's very expansion resistant, so it's very sustainable, but a lot of people don't find it. So again, the key challenge is how do we get people to find these sites? And I'll come to that in the next slide. And so what it turns out, based on our research and quite frankly, decades of management experience, is that a camping containment strategy is probably the best strategy to deal with camping impacts, better than this, dispersed pristine site camping that I started with. It's a particularly good strategy in moderate to high use areas. And so what you're doing is you're trying to pick, trying to survey all the campsites that are out there and pick the most sustainable sites based on these things like topography, rugosity or unevenness of the terrain or rockiness, and grass cover, those three things, but mostly topography. And so you find these sites, and maybe there's 100 sites in an area and only 20 of them are highly sustainable based on topography. Fine, you pick those 20 sites, or maybe the demand is for 30 sites, and so you've got to go out and find 10 new campsites. And that's what we're using the GIS for these days, is how do you find those 10 new campsites efficiently, quickly. But at any rate, the bottom line is you find these places and you make them into what we either call established site camping or designated site camping. Established is you say, hey folks, help us out. Please camp in, this subset of what we consider to be very sustainable sites. Not only are they sustainable, but they also are, a decent distance, like, 200 feet away from water, from trails, from other campsites. And that's going to, and if we have a distributed set of these established sites, then we can avoid these problems of crowding, conflicts, and noise by spacing them well apart from each other. Or in really popular lake basins where there's just unlimited demand, you often have to go to designated site camping, and that's a regulatory approach where if you don't camp on the designated campsites, they will write you a ticket, if they find you. And so the established site camping is voluntary. The designated site camping is required. And so you select these sustainable sites or you construct them. And the site in the upper right-hand corner is a constructed side hill campsite. So we went into sloping terrain, and just as you dig a side hill trail by doing cut and fill work with the soil, you do cut and fill work here, and you shore up the lower side with some rocks and logs and things, and you make a bench campsite. And these sites stay very small forever, even when they're intensively used. And so you find these sites, but how do you get people to find them? If they're out there wandering around, there's 100 campsites, but only 20 of them are ones you want them to use. How do they know which 20 it is? Because particularly when you're in wilderness, they can't use map, they can't use signs. In other words, in wilderness, there's a pretty strong management emphasis on trying to either minimize or not have any signs out there. And so, managers have tried in the past to use maps. It doesn't work really well. You could have some of these established or designated campsites, and you put the little dots on the maps, but if you don't have a really high resolution map, it shows that detail. And if you don't have visitors that are really good at map and compass, then they end up on the wrong sites. And in many cases, the good sites are maybe only 100 feet away from the bad sites. And so how do visitors know? Well, it turns out that there is a new technological solution to this age-old problem, and it's the cell phone. Increasing numbers of visitors are now using cell phone apps. One of them is called Guthook, for example, or Avenza maps. And on these cell phone apps, you open them up. Your phone is communicating with satellites, not cell towers. I mean, you can do that too, but if you're in an area with no cell towers, your phone is communicating to satellites directly. And it knows where you are on the planet Earth within 20 or 30 feet these days. It's quite accurate. And so you open the app and there's a blue dot on the map on your phone. And as you move, the blue dot moves. So the blue dot is you. It's your location on the face of the Earth. And then if that app includes the sustainable sites, but not the unsustainable sites, you can then navigate yourself straight to the sustainable sites. And as you get close to and on top of that site, your blue dot merges with the campsite symbol. And you're on the right site, even though there might be another campsite 100 feet away. And so this is a new, method that we are now trying to get managers to adopt. And some of the managers are a little concerned about this. Quite frankly, they're concerned about wilderness character and whether visitors using their phones to navigate, whether that impedes them from having a true wilderness experience. And I've been telling them that, hey, trust me, I've been hanging with youth for 20 years in the Boy Scouts. And, the youth in my crew could care less. They have absolutely no problems whatsoever using a cell phone in the wilderness to navigate. And if you ask them, does it interfere with their wilderness experience? They say, what are you talking about? No, it doesn't interfere with my wilderness experience. And there's a lot of adults, including myself, who are now using cell phone apps to navigate. And I don't really find it to be a bother either. I can always turn it off if it bothers me. And so, yeah, you do have to carry a brick, a battery to back up your phone at night. You plug it into the brick and it recharges your battery. And you do have to be careful, about your phone, but, and you absolutely carry a map and compass. And so in my venture crew, I've been teaching map and compass. And once they master that, I start letting them use the cell phone apps to navigate, which they love and they'd much prefer to use, quite frankly. But it's a food for thought thing. You guys can talk about it. Like I said, I'm still arguing with some of the managers about this. The key is for me is that, the managers really doesn't matter what they think. The visitors are using the phone apps, whether the managers want them to or not. And so the managers are kind of, quite frankly, irrelevant in that issue. So earlier I shared with you this worst AT camping spot in 2000 at Annapolis Rocks, Maryland, along the AT. And here are the side hill sites. Here's a picture of what one of those sites looks like. It's quite small. It's big enough for one tent. And a campsite might consist of 2 or 3 of these tent pads that are made in sloping ground like this. In this case, we created 14 new side hill campsites. Some of them had 2 and 3 tent pads. And along the entire Appalachian Trail, this policy has been implemented quite substantially. We estimate that there's about 725 of these side hill sites along the Appalachian Trail right now. We've only found 1 in all of our studies on the Pacific Crest Trail, and some of the managers out there are still a little leery about doing this. But I think we'll prevail at some point. But I wanted to share and come back to Annapolis Rocks to share the success that we've had there. And so here's a site map of the area. On the left side of your screen, in sort of the light green, you see the big, huge mega sites and the mega cluster of sites that used to exist in that area. And we closed that entire area. We ended up having to put green sort of snow fencing around it to keep people out. And they've got a site caretaker who resides here during the busy summer months. But what you can see in the middle of the map are the 14 side hill campsites that we created. Actually, I think you're seeing the individual tent pads there. And the original, if you added up the size of all of those early campsites, I believe there were 19 or 20 of them, it was 43,000 square feet of highly impacted ground. And post-construction of the side hill sites, we had only 3,400 square feet of impacted ground. And then you might ask, well, did you recover those sites? So here's one of those sites. I think this is at the end of the first year of closure. And so there's a little bit of recovery here already, mostly organic litter and a bit of moss coming in. So that's not the original site, but here it is in 2019. Again, because people had cut down enough trees on this campsite, there was a fair amount of sunlight coming into the ground, which has supported a very, very dense thicket of grass and herbs. And so it's well on its way to recovery mostly because of that grass. And that's mostly because it's a sunny site, okay? So that's sort of the success we had there. Now I'm gonna run into a second study here where we didn't have quite the success. This is looking at the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. The northern tier has a canoe base up there. I did my PhD work there back in 1982. I went back in 2014 with my venture crew. We did a trip, and then the venture crew drove home. I stayed there with one of the young ladies who helped my 2 doctoral students. They flew in, we picked them up, and then the 4 of us did about 5 weeks of field work to remeasure all of my PhD campsites. And we evaluated quite a different number of factors. I'm not going to go into any of the results for all of that. I'm just going to focus on tree-related indicators, just 2 tree-related indicators, tree damage and stumps, the cutting or felling of trees. So there's a whole study there. We're only going to talk about 2 indicators from that study. The girl on the lower left there was my venture crew girl. She's just finished college, actually, in environmental science and journalism. Okay, so damaged trees. What did we find in that study? Well, what we found was 44% of campsite trees continue to be damaged at a moderate to severe level, 11.1 damaged trees per site. If you do the math, there's 2,000 campsites in the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. These are all designated campsites. It's kind of an unusual place. But if you do the math here, it's 22,200 damaged trees, which is rather stunning. It's actually worse for stumps. And here's some pictures of the stumps. These are, generally small trees that people are in fact cutting down with wood tools to burn in their campfires at night. And many of them are green. If you start a fire with dead wood, you can burn green wood in it. I think that's what people are doing. But again, if you do the math, it's 35,000, cut stumps that we were able to find. And as you can imagine, after 5 or 10 years, the stumps go away. They do rot, particularly stumps of things like, paper birch. They probably don't even last 5 years. And so these are relatively new stumps. And these were either on the campsite or visible from the edge of the campsite, looking into the woods. All right, so that's kind of the protocol that we used in this particular study. And I guess the question is this acceptable? And I would say no. The managers that we worked with that funded the study say, heck no. And it does have consequences. If you look at the picture in the upper left here, you see the campsite back in '82 with lots of trees on it. And the picture in the lower right, that's the picture today. In 2014. And you can see, all but one of those trees is now gone. They've all been cut down. And the blue line there is pointing out a rock that's the same rock in both pictures. And so it does have, big ecological consequences. You canoe along and it's aspen, birch, aspen, birch, aspen, birch, and then there's a huge hole in the canopy campsite, and then aspen, birch, aspen, birch. And so the lake shores are no longer natural looking. And when you get on these campsites, they aren't natural looking. And so I think it is a big issue. It's an unacceptable impact. I don't want to leave us out of the picture here. I have taught several different master educator courses on our local scout camp property. We have 15,000 acres, and we backpack all over the place there. And as we head on out of the scout camp to do our backpacking, we walked through these campsites, and I stopped and did a little teachable moment, and the person doing their particular presentation was on tree damage that day. And so we spent a fair amount of time looking at the damaged trees done entirely by Boy Scouts, because we're at a Boy Scout camp here. And so what's the sort of the challenge for Leave No Trace, I think, in this situation is that we're interested in preventing avoidable impacts. And you can have a campfire and pick up dead and down wood that you can break by hand and burn to ash quickly. You do not need woods tools. You don't need that axe. You don't need that saw. You don't need that hatchet. You can have a high quality campfire for your group and not have any of those tools with you. And I've been doing that for 20 years with first my troop and now my venture crew. We never carry any woods tools on any of our trips. We do use those tools, but only when we do conservation projects like, trail construction and maintenance. And so the key here is to minimize campfire impacts by, use a lightweight stove for cooking, a candle lantern or electric lighting for lighting. Only build a campfire when it's legal, when it's safe, when you have an existing fire site present. And then, hey folks, just leave those wood stools at home. There's really no reason to be carrying those around. They're dangerous. I've had, I don't know how many incidents from my youth where people, were, slipping with the tool and cutting themselves or almost cutting a toe off, things like that. And so it's best if we just try to disassociate those tools from our scouting trips and from our camping entirely. At least that's my advice, my personal advice, is to do that. And it's been kind of a pet peeve for a long time for me. Wanted to share a few results here, just I think 3 slides on a hammock strap study that we did. And so this was done by one of my venture crew youth. She was a senior. Her name is Shayla. She was in an AP high school research class, and I was her mentor for that. We looked at different impacts associated with paracord and 1-inch straps and 3-inch strap or 2-inch straps, sorry, of hanging up a hammock. And so we tested sort of 2 different options. One is where if you pull the hammock pretty tight, you have about a 20-degree arc from the parallel down to the hammock line. And if you set up a loose hammock hang, it's about a 47-degree arc. And when she set those up and did some tests, and then we did basically some math, there's some calculus involved, I believe. She's an engineering student at UVA right now. We found that for the average U.S. male who weighs about 198 pounds, it turns out, the force exerted on a tree from a loose hang is 135 pounds, and from a tight hang is 298 pounds. And so I can share that math with you if you want, but more than double. And so we started trying to do this study with a hammock and with tying to trees. But our trials had very inconsistent results. The straps would slide off of our foam. We were using foam to look at, mimicking bark, basically, closed cell, high density foam. And it either slid off or it folded up or it angled into the foam, and we just weren't getting good results. And so we set it up this way with a hang, a vertical hang in the picture at the right. And that worked really well. And we then measured the depth of indentation with calipers in that foam. And here's the results real quick. The axis at the bottom is the location around the tree. If you look at the image in the upper right, 0 was always up towards the sky, and the negative numbers on that one side and the positive numbers on the other side. So we're trying to see, well, where are the stresses happening to the tree? And you'd think it might be at 0, right? But in fact, it wasn't. I was kind of surprised by that. And so here's the graphs, and you can look at this and decide what happened in the study in 1 minute. The paracord, which was less than 1/4 of an inch thick, cut into the foam in a huge way. The 1-inch straps, were way better, significantly better, at distributing that load around the tree safely and with less force. And the 2-inch straps were more than adequate. And so the chief results here are that you really should not use any kind of paracord or narrow rope when you're setting up a hammock. You should always use at least a 1-inch strap. I would even dare say that a 3/4 inch strap probably shouldn't be used, but at least a 1-inch strap, and if you can get a 2-inch strap, that's certainly way better. And a tight hang is bad news. And so if you can tolerate sort of a loose hang, that's way less force. It's a 291% difference if you do the math. In the force that you're exerting on that tree bark if you do a tight hang versus a loose hang. And then I've been using hammocks for about 20 years now, and I've written a paper on low impact hammock camping, and in that paper it's recommended that we use trees that are about 6 inches in diameter or larger, and preferably a tree that has harder bark rather than soft bark, like avoid the corky bark type trees. And preferably no lichen on that bark or moss or things like that that's going to get smashed and rubbed off. And then also, set up your hammock and cook in over or above really durable spots. Like again, not over a dense, vegetated area of herbs or ferns or things like that. Over either, organic litter that's barren, no vegetation, or again, over grass, although in a grassy area, you're not going to find trees. And also save the best, spots for tenters. They want to use that. All right, I need to run through this. I got a few more slides here. I think I can finish up. We want to demonstrate the utility and the effectiveness of Leave No Trace in our sort of communication of Leave No Trace practices. And by doing that, by evaluating the efficacy of our Leave No Trace, programming, we can justify the agency and the organizational investment in Leave No Trace. And we can also use the results of studies like this next one in improving the effectiveness of our Leave No Trace educational efforts. And so there's been traditionally sort of 4 different methods of evaluating efficacy. You can do a before and after like test of knowledge. So, you ask them, well, what should you do with your gray water? And then you do your educational, messaging, and then you ask them again at some later point, like when they come out of the wilderness. You can also ask them when they come out of the wilderness, well, what did you do with your gray water? And so some of the people coming out had been taught what to do with it, and you ask them, okay, did you do that? And they say yes or no. And of course, they can lie. Amazingly enough, most studies have shown that they actually don't lie, that they tell you the truth. But it's still a reported behavior. And so the validity of sort of test of knowledge, reported behavior is not terribly high. It's okay, but it's not perfect. Observation is certainly better. We can hide in the woods or hide out in plain sight, but we can watch people. Okay, did they walk off trail when they were asked not to walk off trail to protect rare plants or something like that, or the alpine ecosystem, please stay on the trail, and then we watch them from far away with binoculars or something. We've done those kinds of studies. I've done those kinds of studies. But again, what do managers want? What's the bottom line for a manager? Well, it'd be nice to observe behavior and see that people are doing the Leave No Trace behavior you're trying to get them to do. But the bottom line is, did it actually measurably affect actual resource conditions? Like, are the campsites smaller? Are there no nails in trees? Do I not find improperly disposed human waste after I teach them the right way to do a cat hole? That's what managers really care about. And so amazingly enough, when we went out and looked at the literature here, we found literally only 2 studies that evaluated actual changes in resource conditions. And so when Nita Satina, she was a sort of a mid-career person in the Maryland State Parks, she approached me through the Leave No Trace community and said, hey, I'm doing sort of a mid-career master's thesis, and I need to do some research, and I'm thinking I'd like to do something with Leave No Trace. So I worked very closely with Nita, and we developed this study that I'm going to present to you fairly quickly here. We looked at the efficiency of Leave No Trace education to reduce impacts from camping, and these were at road-accessed campsites in Maryland, in a Maryland state forest. They had to drive down the gravel road, and you camp at one of these designated sites along the road. And we did 3 different treatments. We had non-personal, which was just brochures or posters. We had personal, which was a Forest Service, a state Forest Service interpreter that had been trained in Leave No Trace. Then we did a combination of both of those. And then we did a control where we didn't do any education at all, okay? So we had 3 treatments plus the control. We looked at littering. So we went to these campsites before and after the target groups used the campsites, right? And we looked at litter on the site, and then we cleaned it all up. We looked at nails in trees on the site. They often hammer nails in to hang stuff from, like tarps or lanterns. And we removed the nails after we counted them. And then we looked at surface disposed human waste, improperly disposed human waste. And we counted those and then removed those by burying. And so we did these camp assessments before and after, and then we did our treatments. And so I don't have time to really share this in detail, but that's our messaging, either the brochure, 2 sides of it right there on the left, or the bulletin board on the right. So that it was attractive stuff. It was nice stuff, and it wasn't too terribly long. I mean, you could read through it in 5 minutes. And you did this when you got your permit. You had to have a permit to use these campsites. And so we looked at the results of this big study, and NEDA found that, leave no trace communication efforts did significantly reduce litter, tree damage, and surface disposal of human waste. So it worked. It was effective, right? A salient finding was, sort of based on measured changes in resource conditions. And I mentioned that that's a pretty rare study design. And it's a higher validity. But what did we find? Well, the brochures and posters were not as effective as the personal communication, as you might expect. The only thing that the brochures and posters did was it affected nails in trees and reduced them from 13% down to 1%, which is highly effective. The problem is that these materials are often not always read by visitors. It's sort of like it's up to them to take the time to read them. And if they did read them, they may not share them with other people in their group, right? So again, not quite as effective. And printed material isn't quite as compelling as personally delivered material. You've probably all experienced that yourself, both in hearing from others as well as trying to teach others, right? It's easier to communicate in person. The results when the interpretive person stopped at their campsite and said, hey folks, I wanted to chat with you for 5 minutes about, sort of low impact camping practices. And they would then, say the same things, the same information was conveyed to them in person that was in the brochure or in the poster, which they didn't see because those were taken down during this treatment, all right, during the personal treatment. But the personal treatment reduced litter from 5.9 to 2.5 pieces, human waste from 63% to 40%. So again, not as much as we had thought or hoped, but a significant reduction nonetheless. And then nails from 13% down to 4%. And so the personal communication messages were more effective. Also much better at trying to explain a complex behavior like how do you dig a cat hole. I mean, it's much harder to communicate that with a brochure than it is to walk someone through the steps, using using words, right? And so that's kind of the results of that study. It was, like I said, very effective. Nita Satina is now the director of state parks for Maryland, and very successful. And so I applaud her for sticking to it with me. This site got written up in her thesis and then sat for a good many years before we finally got the paper written and published. It just came out literally this past week. And I think I'm done. I've got maybe 1 minute.
So Jeff, I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
There was an overwhelming amount of participants who wanted to know precisely what the two GPS apps were that you recommended. And I'm going to ask you when you're finished, if you wouldn't mind just posting that on the on chat. You can go down to chat and select all attendees and post links to those websites. I think they would be most appreciative.
Yeah, I can do that.
An earlier question came in regarding the campsite that was on the crest of the ridge, and asking about danger, safety, like thunderstorms, and did that enter into your decision process on top of the ridge?
Yeah.
And how accepting is the public to camping on a slope or rugged terrain?
Yeah, good, great questions. So let's see, the ridge campsite, that was one that Susie and this wilderness ranger and I used for one night. It was not really, quite frankly, a pristine site. It was one that other visitors had used before, including this particular wilderness ranger that we were with. It's probably not the best site to make into a designated site or a established site because of its position on top of that ridge. Although there was a much, much higher, very high ridge above us. Okay, so we were like on a sub ridge about half or 3/4 of the way up the side of the slope. There was a big, much higher mountain above us that would have attracted any lightning. And there was enough flat terrain there, and it wasn't so steep that there were cliffs anywhere near us. So it was a pretty safe site, I think. Probably not the best for lightning, but not bad. Let me see. What was your very first question?
It had to do with the safety, as long as, did that enter into your decision-making process?
Yeah. Yeah, the big safety issue, quite frankly, with these, with the containment strategy, with the designated and established site camping, is what do you do about the liability associated with hazardous trees? In other words, if you're requiring or requesting that people use a certain site, does the agency become then more liable to protect you against hazard trees that might fall on you? And I've looked into the case law on that issue, and the answer is 90% no, that the agencies are not that liable. But there's always that 10% wild lawsuit that you're going to lose, and so it's a little dicey for managers to go there. Anything else?
Howie Peer came in with a statement saying that he has had difficulty with participants creating their own personal definition of the difference between grasses and forbs. And do you have a definition that you like to use?
Yeah, so a forb is a broad-leafed herb, and so a broad-leafed herb, they tend to be plants that have a stem like jewelweed or stickweed that, if you step on it once or twice or a few times, you're going to break the stem and the leaves will then wilt and the plant will probably die. And so a broadleafed herb or a forb is something that it reacts very negatively to trampoline. And almost always they grow under a forest canopy. Now, it may be a very light forest canopy or a reasonably heavy forest canopy, but they're shade loving. They prefer the shade. Grasses, they will grow in the shade, but they aren't very resistant or resilient when they're growing in the shade. They're only resistant and resilient when they're growing in, 75% sun or greater, I would say. And so the easiest way is to forget the plants, just simply camp in a place that's 75% or greater sunny, and you'll be fine. The grasses will grow in those kinds of places, and the herbs will still get trampled out. Most of them. There are some herbs that will grow in full sun. Everyone knows, Traxicum, dandelions, or plantain. Those are two common weeds in your yard that will grow in full sun. And those two weeds happen to be very durable. Those are broadleaf herbs, but they're durable ones. They're very low to the ground and they have stems that don't break.
I'm going to try to breeze through some of these other ones. What about a sandy beach to set up camp?
Yeah, sand, if it's on a slope at all, that's not so good because the sands will shift around quite a bit and they'll shift downhill. They'll be disturbed and pushed downhill, and so that's not so good. But if it's a flat sandy area, that's fine. I take my venture crew sea kayaking out to the Outer Banks, and we camp on the sand every 2 years. And that's reasonably flat and it works really well. And you avoid the dunes, of course. The dune grasses, you stay the heck out of those. But if you're on sand, that's perfect. And typically it's either blown around or washed around or, flooded now and then. And the natural disturbance is far in excess of any human disturbance that happens in those kinds of environmental settings. So like, the sandbar on the Ozark Riverway, that's a good place to camp. It's very durable and it gets flooded several times a year anyways. And so there's no grass or vegetation on that sandbar. It's a naturally disturbed place to do your camping. Same thing if you're whitewater rafting out west. On most of the western rivers, they often ask rafters to camp on the beaches and on the shorelines very close to water. And because when you go uphill, you get into the riparian vegetation and there's almost no good place to camp in those kinds of spots.
Jeff, there's a whole bunch more questions. If you have time after you're done and like to type in some answers, our viewers would love to hear from you. I'm going to leave you with one last one. This comes from Morgan Bruckner. Hi, Morgan. Can we elaborate on what a loose hang is and how to set that up, please? Yeah,
well, a loose hang is you just don't pull those hammock straps really tight. Some people pull them as tight as they possibly can. And in fact, when I first started hammocking, I did that. And it wasn't for years that I discovered that that was really bad. It's amazing that, if you pull them really tight like that, you're more than doubling the force that you put on that tree. And so, put them up and kind of let the hammock hang. If you know what 20 degrees is, you can probably visualize 90 degrees and 45 degrees. Well, take, a little less than half of the 45 degrees. That's about 20 degrees. That's kind of and this is when you're in the hammock, right? That would be bad, 20 degrees. You probably can't get it any less than 20, no matter how hard you pull it, right? 40, I think the other number was 47 degrees. So roughly a 45 degree, you can get in your hammock and have someone say, is that about 45 degrees? But bottom line, it's just simply don't pull those things really tight when you're putting your hammock up. Leave them a bit loose. And that's all it takes, quite frankly.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your outstanding presentation. Again, there's a whole bunch of questions we'd love to have you take a look at after you're done. And thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.